Resuming our discussion from the last segment, if you recall, we ended that segment with a quote from Condoleezza Rice talking about the new policy that by pursuing our principles, she said, we should be able to support the democratic movement and liberty in all of Middle East, and the original policy really was a failure. So as this policy is moving forward, you can imagine how the dictatorial regimes that we had aligned ourselves under this Holy Trinity. Remember, originally they were the means to our end. After Cold War, they became one of the ends, the third one in the Holy Trinity. So these people are becoming very concerned about the direction of the United States policy, and they begin to deeply worry about where are we heading. So there was this brief interlude of few years when confusion reigned among our so-called moderate responsible allies. We like to call them moderate responsible rather than autocratic regimes. And so they were worried about the direction of the United States. For example, President Mubarak was really confused, was wondering, are we truly serious about this or not? And so he actually, in terms of adjusting to it and testing the water, he did start thinking that this is, at least in the short run, is a little bit serious. He did allow some election, and the election was a little bit freer than prior election, but he was beginning to worry. Even more worrying about this turn were our good friend the Saudis, who absolutely had no intention of changing the system, because they knew if they do, their days are going to be numbered. And so were the other Gulf monarchies, and so was the case with the kings in Morocco and the king in Jordan and so forth. And as this was as they were beginning to express their concern, and there was some confusion, plus all the setbacks that we will shortly experience in Iraq once the occupation begin to look like a quagmire. With all of that happening, soon reality began to trump principles and trump values and idealism. The Bush administration began to realize that they could not really push very far with their democracy agenda without really overturning much of the Middle East. And this whole alliance system that we had put together back in the late 1950s was going to unravel, was going to fall apart. And Saudi Arabia and other wealthy Gulf monarchies indeed played a vital role, a critical role in not only ensuring adequate supply of oil to the West and to the United States, but also to do so with stable prices, and all of that affected our economy. So now we're beginning to really have reality remind us that our principles may not be easily implemented, if that's what we want, as a foreign policy thrust in the Middle East. So the Bush team began to retreat from the new forward policy, and instead they began to apply the policy selectively. So what does that mean? It means that we went back to our old ways. Iran and Syria, yes, democracy is needed for those countries because they're our enemies. But Egypt, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Qatar, Kuwait, Jordan, Morocco, no, none of these countries, we're not going to touch them. So again, democracy is going to be selectively enforced. So a couple of years after the Iraq War, we went back to actually restoring the post-Cold War Holy Trinity that we were forced to change in the aftermath of 9/11. So in other words, we continued back with the old policy as if 9/11 had not happened. As a personal observation, I must say that this was one of the worst period in United States foreign policy that I can recall, and it really deserved to be viewed that way. Meanwhile, in Iraq, under the protection of our military occupation, Iraqis began to actually exercise some democratic rights. They went to poll beginning in January of 2005 to vote for an interim parliament. So they have a new parliament, and one of the tasks of this parliament is to come up with a new constitution. So in October 2005, we do get Iraqis' approval of a new constitution, and with the new constitution, Iraq becomes an Islamic federal democracy. They had to make concession to the Shiites, religious group who were very powerful at the time, and they wanted some version of Islamic elements in the constitution. So they made that compromise in the name, and then of course it is democratic and it is federal. Federal was very important for the Kurds to emphasize that just like United States in a federal system, the states or the provinces should have a great deal of autonomy. In reality, it was more of a confederate rather than a federal system. It was because the autonomy that they wanted was much more, just like the way we had the situation in this country under the Article of Confederacy. And then again in December of 2005, Iraq really holds its first election for a permanent parliament. But by now, Iraqis' politics is becoming very complicated, as many of these factors, the sectarian factors, the ethnic factors, the secular religious division are playing into this and making it difficult for Parliament to have any consensual attitude toward policymaking and toward governance. February 22nd, 2006, we have a major development, and that is the bomb attack on the Al-Askari Mosque, which is a Shiite shrine in Samarra. And the event was really one of the most devastating, had one of the most devastating impact on Iraq, because you can think of that as the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back. Before that attack, there were several attacks on the Shiites by the Sunnis, who were now disgruntled and very unhappy about the turn of events and political change that had taken place in Iraq, with the Shiites becoming the dominant power because they were the majority. And but the Shiites pretty much did not respond in any strong tit-for-tat way. However, the bombing of the Al-Askariya Mosque was the event that did it for them. It made them launch a vicious attack on the Sunnis, and the sectarian fighting between the Shiites and Sunni began in earnest. Now, it is at this point also that Al-Qaeda saw a tremendous opportunity to reconstitute itself after its devastating defeat in Afghanistan in the hands of the United States and Afghani forces. and the Al-Qaeda in Iraq began to play a very instrumental role in fomenting the Shiite-Sunni division by attacking and bombing Shiite sites and Shiite neighborhoods and provoking Shiites' retaliation. After a while, the retaliation became pretty much automatic. And remember, from Al-Qaeda's perspective, the Shiites are viewed as heretics, and therefore they're fair game. After the bombing of Al-Askari Mosque, the sectarian fighting really was becoming a civil war in everything, in all but in name. And this continued on. In the meantime, the government is trying to form a cabinet, and in April of 2006, after a month of deadlock, we have Nouri al-Maliki becoming the prime minister of Iraq, because he was finally able to form a coalition to put together a government. Now, under the Shiite control, the courts and every system that Iraq had was now under the Shiites. And remember, Saddam had been captured about a year after the invasion. And now what we have in December of 2006, the Shiites dominated court. They put Saddam on trial and they hang him shortly after for the crimes that he had committed. And remember now, this is the time that this event further fans the flame of hatred between the Shiite and Sunni, because the Sunnis were really the supporter of Saddam. And meanwhile, the sectarian killing is escalating and in many ways continuing unabated, without a clear exit strategy for the United States, which is now caught in this civil war. The Bush administration decides that the only way that they could bring an end to United States presence there so they can get out is to first quell the sectarian conflict, and in so doing they decide that they have to increase the troop size, hoping that with additional troops providing more surveillance and security, this will bring an end to the sectarian conflict. Therefore, in January of 2007, after some debate, we have the troop surge, and President Bush commits an additional 20,000 troops to Iraq to help bring this sectarian conflict and bombing to an end. The situation actually begins to improve very soon after the troop surge, and therefore there was a natural tendency among the supporters of the president policy to give the credit to troop surge for having succeeded in significantly reducing the fighting and the bombing, the daily bombing that were happening in the various neighborhoods. However, such a conclusion really is unwarranted. The fact of the matter is that by the time the additional troops arrived in Iraq, the ethnic cleansing of the mixed Shiite-Sunni neighborhoods and areas had already been completed. And therefore, one of the main causes of the daily killings and bombings had already been pretty much exhausted. So by the time our troop had arrived, the neighborhood had already been cleansed ethnically and sectarianly, and people had been pretty much exhausted. All the killings that had to be done was already done. Therefore, on the surface, on a superficial level, yes, it seemed like troop surge appeared to have worked, but it was only because of the coincidence of timing that the diminished fighting coincided with the troop surge that made it look as if the troop surge was effective. But as I said, the main reason for this was that the fighting had pretty much been done, and both sides were exhausted. They had isolated and cleansed the neighborhood, and therefore there was really not much more need for fighting. So by March 2010, parliamentary election for the second parliament commenced, and no coalition, however, was able to win sufficient votes to form a government. And therefore there was a kind of a stalemate for a while. November 11, 2010, finally, after some 8 months of delay, Nouri al-Maliki is able to form his second government, and he becomes once again the Prime Minister of Iraq.